Next.js 16 secretly added 4 caching directives, and you probably only know one of them. You may have heard the use cache directive. Allows you to mark a page, component, or a function as cacheable. You add the line use cache, and boom, it's cached. We've all hopefully seen that one by now. But it turns out there are 3 more caching flavors that probably no one's even talking about, and even I missed them in one of my cache components deep dive video. One of them is super cool and honestly my favorite. So in this video, I'm going to break down all 4 caching directives and show you exactly how they all work with real-world practical examples, so you know when to use each one and what makes them different. I'm also going to say if you upgrade your app to Next.js 16 and don't know these cache directives, you're probably going to run into a lot of errors and won't know exactly how to solve them. So make sure you learn each one of these directives before you upgrade your app to Next.js 16. So let's quickly dive in. Now I'm putting together a Next.js 16 deep dive cheat sheet with all different code examples that we'll be covering in this specific video and more. So if you are interested, check the link in the description below. The Next.js 16 added the cache components feature, which is a opt-in feature. If you go to your next config file and add cache components as true, then you can cache your components page or your function easily. And it works hand in hand with partial pre-rendering. And partial pre-rendering is a feature that allows you to cache your static components, but then things that need to be dynamic and we need to wait for data, you could wrap it up in a suspense boundary and it's just gonna simply work. Now, as part of cache components, in order for you to cache a component, add the directive called as use cache. And again, this is a cache components feature. If you try to use cache without setting cache components as true, then it's probably not going to work. So make sure to set this flag. Once you do, let's go ahead and take a look at this application to see how use cache works. This is a cache components exploit app that I have created. You see a list of products here. And these all products are in fact fetched from a mock API, for example. Now you can see this console log page component rendered and this product list, which is exactly the specific product list. If I click on it, we are fetching a bunch of products. We are calling these products, and then we have a button here that we'll take a look at later. And each one of these cards here are the product cards here. And product card simply is a link component which navigates to a new page, fetches some other data. We'll get to that in a second. Now, if we go back to cache components, since now that we have this enabled, if we go to the terminal, let's see what happens. I'm going to clear this flag and now let's refresh the page. You will immediately seeing this console log page component rendered, which is this console log that we added here. However, you are also seeing this error called as uncached data was accessed outside of suspense boundaries. Because again, the minute you add cache components as true, you probably want to tell Next.js which components need to be cached and which components need to be streamed in a bit later. So for example, in our case, we have product list here. So let's simply add a use cache directive here. And as we do, I go back here, you're going to see that error is gone. Again, let's clear the console and refresh the page. And now you will notice that, in fact, page component rendered, it's coming from the cache. If I remove this and go back here, you can see it's no longer coming from the cache. So the fact that we added use cache means that product list is in fact cached. Now, for static content, use cache works great. We know how it works. We just add the use cache directive and it works. However, when it comes to dynamic content, we also want to cache that sometimes. And in our application, we're going to have a mix of two, static as well as dynamic content. Now let's take a look at by clicking at the specific link, which is a dynamic route. So if I refresh the page, you're now going to see an error. But let's take a look at this page first. This is a dynamic route because it in fact checks the params, gets the ID, and then renders product details as well as recommendations. Now, if we take a look at the error, it says that uncached data was accessed outside of suspense. Now, by default, whenever cache components is true, we need to inform Next.js what content needs to be cached and what content is dynamic. In this case, Next.js needs to know what needs to happen. So in that case, what we need to do is wrap this dynamic route inside of a suspense boundary. This way, we are letting Next.js know that, hey, you could show this fallback while the rest of the content can get streamed in. So what we could do is use the layout file inside of Next.js and add that here, because this specific layout file is going to wrap all the children dynamic routes. So we could just say product layout and then add a suspense boundary here and a fallback here and import suspense from React. Now, as we do, if I refresh the page, you're going to see loading product details, which is the same fallback that we provided here. And the rest of the content appears, it gets streamed in, and it's not cached. I have some good news. I have a Black Friday sale going on both my signature courses, the Modern Full Stack Next.js course. It teaches you everything you need to know to build and deploy production-ready applications. We, in fact, ship 7+ production-ready apps inside the course itself, so rest assured you will truly master Next.js. And that course is 40% off. Or if you sign up for my leadership course called as Developer to Leader, which teaches you all the skills that you need to know to lead a team. If you've never led before, that's totally fine. This course will teach you that and get you there. And if you ask me, in this ever-changing world of AI, it's extremely important to learn how to lead in some form so that you can stand out and level up your skills and increase your salary. If you want to do both, if you want to master Next.js as well as level up your leadership skills, then I have an exciting deal for you. I have a bundle called as a Level Up bundle, which is 50% off on both my courses. So definitely check it out. The links are in the description below. And I also have regional pricing. So definitely use the code in the banner if you need it. I really hope to see you inside the courses. All right, back to the video. But again, our application is going to have a lot of dynamic data. Maybe for the first time, we need to fetch it. But the next time, we could simply cache it. We don't want to keep refetching the data over and over again. Because how many times is this product, Incredible Silk Pizza, title is going to change? Maybe the price might change, but the title, description, even maybe the recommendations would be the same. So how do we handle that? Well, let's try and see if we cache it, if we cache this entire page, what happens. Now, if I go here and if we cache this page, it's going to now give us an error saying that the dynamic route uses cookies inside use cache. Because if you take a look at the recommendations component, it essentially gets the personalized recommendations and it uses cookies for that. It checks if user has a cookie for session ID or just assigns a guest cookie. And this is a dummy function, but it gives you a list of recommendations based on the product ID. Well, first off, we could just move this use cache directive and only cache maybe these 3 items. So we can go to product details here and then add use cache here. This way, if we go to the console, let's clear everything. And let's refresh the page. You can see product details component render console log is in fact coming from the cache because we have added this console log here, right here. So this component is cached, which is awesome. This is another reason why you need to split your architecture and have multiple components that do a specific thing. This way we could cache them whenever necessary. But what about recommendations? Maybe the first time we want to get dynamic content, but the next time we want to cache it, for example. What do we do then? Well, what we could do is use another directive inside of use cache called as use cache private. It again just works just like use cache, but it allows you to use the runtime APIs like cookies, headers, search params, and so on. So what we could do here is add the directive use cache private. And this would mean that we could use these directives whenever there are cookies or headers, so it will cache it and work exactly the same way. If I go to recommendations right now and add a console log for recommendations component rendered and refresh the page, they're still going to see this log appear because we have not actually cached the component. We have just cached the specific function. So let's move this log in here and let's say personalized recommendation. It's not a component, so let's just say personalized recommendation render. And if I refresh the page, you can see that first time it is dynamic. The next time it in fact appears from the cache because it has cached it. So whenever you have cookies, headers, anything dynamic, you could think of extracting it out and use the use cache private directive. But again, the first time it appears, you want to still wrap it in a suspense boundary. You want to still tell Next.js that, hey, that specific content might be dynamic. So we could wrap it in a suspense boundary here, just like that. Save it. And now, again, it has already cached it, so it won't work. And if I go here and let's add a bit of a delay here so we know it works. So we can say maybe 4,000 here, simulate a slow API call. If I refresh it now, you can see loading recommendations appear for 4 seconds and then appears. But now if I refresh it again, you're no longer going to see that slow API call because it has automatically cached. So you can already see the first time it's going to fetch it. The next time it has cached it. So it just retrieves it from the cache. So let's do one more thing. Let's go ahead and simulate an API call here by adding this set timeout value that simulates a slow API call. Now I'm gonna again delete the cache. You could also just right click and do it, or Command Shift R and delete the cache. And now you're going to see loading recommendations fallback appear and then the content appears. But this time if I refresh the page, you're still right away going to see the content. You don't see that suspense boundary anymore because it has automatically cached. In fact, if we go back to our code, our terminal, you're going to see personalized recommendations rendered appears from the cache. First, the cache gets skipped, but the next time it doesn't get skipped and it just shows personalized recommendations rendered. So that's exactly how use cache private works. Now, use cache private works great whenever there is user personalized items. For example, we were checking inside of recommendations, the cookies information, which is again personal to the user. If we are getting authentication information, taking user ID, and then giving them something personal, that is very specific to the user. You're probably going to access headers, we're going to access cookies, and you want to cache that, for instance, for that specific user, then you could use cache private. However, what about this dynamic content? Things that is dynamic, they are not specific to the user, but they're just dynamic in general. For example, we cached title and description, not the price. The price itself could be dynamic. It is dynamic in general. We always want the specific price to be dynamically rendered in that case. So what do we do then? So if we take a look at product details, we have the product price component, and this specific product price, for instance, takes a very long time to be retrieved because we are maybe calling it a separate API or something like that. The rest of the content can still be fetched pretty instantly, but this specific price takes time or it's dynamic. So what do we do with that? You still want to cache it, right? So if we are using a dynamic API in that case, for instance, we are using a function called as connection. This makes product price as dynamic, for example. And the minute we use that connection, that means whenever we use anything dynamic inside a product, inside of a cache component, well, you cannot use cached private here because we have nothing specific to the user. This is just data that's dynamic because it uses a dynamic API. Well, in that case, we could use cache remote, which would enable caching of shared data in dynamic context where regular use cache just wouldn't work. So for example, they're using connection API or cookies or headers, but again, it's not user specific. We just need to use dynamic content. Then in that case, we could simply just use cache remote here. But we run into another error here. If I refresh the page, you're going to see that this route uses connection inside of use cache. So we cannot cache this data here. So we definitely need to wrap it in a suspense boundary here because this is dynamic content, for example. Now, as we do that, as we refresh the page, you're going to see that it's instant. So now we could just simply refresh it and it's going to render. However, keep this in mind that it's pretty fast, it's pretty instant. So let's slow down the request here, just like we did earlier. And now if I refresh the page, or I guess we'll have to delete the cache, you can see loading product price and then the price appears because it's slow, the API. The rest of the content is up here. And what we could do here is we have product price here. We still want to cache get product API. So what we could do is again add use cache here, because again, use cache works regardless in all the other cases. So then you can see loading product price, loading recommendation, but the title and description have already appeared because we have cached them, for example. So that's exactly how the third cache flavor use cache remote works. Again, it can seem confusing, but the way I would like to differentiate is anytime you have static content, simply use cache works. Anytime you have dynamic content, you have two options. If you have user-specific data, such as getting it data from cookies, headers, and so on, then in that case, you always want to use cache private because it's private data. But whenever you just have dynamic data that doesn't necessarily need to be attached to a specific user, then use cache remote. But now there's one more directive that we need to talk about. All right. Now you're probably waiting for the fourth caching flavor, which is my favorite so far. And this one lets you create named cache bucket instead of using the default in-memory cache, which the other cache directives do. So if you add use cache remote, use cache private, they're going to use the in-memory cache to cache your data. So for example, if your server restarts, that cache is gone. Next time the user comes to your application, after a server restart, it's going to fetch the data again and then cache it. Again, this will only be active as long as the server is active. The server restarts, the cache is gone because it uses in-memory cache. But what if we want to provide our own cache? We want to say, don't cache it use in the in-memory cache it on Redis or some custom solution that you probably have. Then in that case, you could do that with the specific cache handler, which is the fourth caching flavor. Super useful if you're running multiple instances. With this method, we could create cache bucket. So let's take a look at what I have created here. So first off, if we go to next config file, we need to pass in a cache handler here. And I'm going to call this cache handler analytics. And this is a custom file that I need to create to tell Next.js that whenever anyone uses analytics cache handler, what should happen. So now if you see this new folder here called as analytics handler, and this is a super basic in-memory cache just for demo purposes. But you could think of this being replaced with Redis or any other caching mechanisms you have. It gets the cache data based on the cache key. It sets it. So basically it's get and set. You can imagine there'll be refreshing tags, expiry, updating tags, and so on. Now, again, if you have a custom solution and you don't want to lean on in-memory cache, this is a very handy solution. But as you can see, there's a lot of management you have to do versus leaning on Next.js entirely. But anywho, let's take a look at implementing this. So now that we have analytics 1, so we could just go to page and here, let's just switch it to use cache analytics. At the minute we do so, let's go back to the terminal. We may have to restart the server, but I've already gone ahead and done that. If I refresh the page, you will still see the cache content, in fact, still coming from the cache as well. So our cache works. So this is how you could easily swap it. By adding this, I'm telling Next.js that, hey, I want you to store this in that analytics cache instead of the default one. So this is a custom cache handler that I have created. Now, when should you use a custom cache handler? Again, most applications don't need it. The default one works. But again, if you want to store it on Redis and so on, you want to share your cache across instances, then, or you could also just change the storage type. Instead of storing it on disk, you want to store it somewhere in an external caching service or database or something like that, then you could do that as well. And what we did was, again, use the API, the cache handler API. It must implement this specific cache handler interface to make it work with the existing solutions. If you ask me, it's a little complicated to manage your own thing. But again, Next.js offers this if you have something custom as well. So having said that, these are all the different caching flavors, caching directives with use cache. You could create something custom. You can cache user-specific data that use cache private. You can cache dynamic content with use cache remote, or if you just have simple static data, then you can add use cache. You learn how to wrap your components to suspense boundaries and so on as well. Having said that, I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please comment below and let me know what other content I should create videos on. I really need ideas. So please comment below and let me know what confuses about Next.js or anything that I cover on this specific channel. So having said that, I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.